Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi there, Herman and Corin. So one of those words that we hear more about in recent years is neurodiversity. And we did a really interesting episode lately on architecture and how neurodesign, how architects can build for a specific, we were looking at it more from the vantage point of a mainstream or a generalist population using a hotel. But I have to say, my wife and her business partner were both very impressed by the episode. And I actually really enjoyed it too, because we talked about how the subtleties in terms of the Kelvin values of lighting actually make these almost subtle differences. It really is like kind of an automatic thing that you can go into a space that if the lighting and the space, and even down to the level of the shapes that were used, I find that absolutely fascinating. The way that our brain instinctively has these associations based on the human history that you would never think about. But it was a really, really good one for those looking for a good accompaniment to this episode. Search for neurodesign in our podcast history, and you'll be able to find it. Herman and Corin, I'd love to talk about neurodiversity, as I mentioned, because I've talked about my ADHD in a number of episodes. We've talked about stuff like the always fun rabbit hole, or Easter egg hunt is a better analogy maybe, of trying to get Vyvanse when you've been prescribed it. ADHD bureaucracy is kind of a nightmare, but it's often used, neurodiversity, I feel like, as a kind of word to subtly hint at ADHD and autism. And I asked our co-producer, who shan't be named, for he is a different AI model, but it ends with GBT and starts with chat. I asked, are autism and ADHD the most, does it mean more than that? And it said dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's, some forms of intellectual disability, sometimes psychiatric conditions. Okay. But let me actually just repeat what I asked ChatGPT, because I think these are questions that I trust you and Corin are better equipped to answer. This isn't flattery, Herman and Corin. I don't want you to get too big for your breeches, but I do love how the responses we get in this podcast are so well fleshed out. Are autism and ADHD the only forms, or does it include more? And what, practically speaking, does neurodiversity mean? I understand that it's not a clinical label. So if so, what importance does it have? I think what I was trying to get at there was, if neurodivergence isn't something, you don't go to your doctor or your psychiatrist and walk out with a diagnosis for Vyvanse for treating neurodiversity. It's a catch-all for describing different conditions. And I guess we want to always think about the value or the potential utility and potential other consequences of having an additional label in a world where it feels like that's often the last things that we need. I often use the term neurodiversity myself when trying to articulate how my own sensory world, and I've talked about my particular sensory mix, which is that I'm sensitive to sound when I'm trying to work, and sometimes also to smell, that other people have just different brains than I do. And if your brain doesn't, if you're writing an essay and someone cooks something that smells really strong, and your brain doesn't start thinking or being pulled away from the task of working on an essay or working on a project, then your brain works in a different way than mine does. And it's not about, it's kind of a healthy envy maybe, that I'd love to have. It'd be cool if my brain worked more normally, but it's maybe a framework for, if not celebrating the diversity of how our brains work, at least kind of accepting it, that we have differences. I mentioned, or maybe I didn't in a podcast, that I worked with a couple of people who were autistic in a previous job, and it was actually one of the most intriguing experiences because on the one hand, ADHD and autism, we sometimes feel like we're sister conditions, and a lot of the sensory stuff, as I mentioned, that I struggle with is really, really pronounced in autism, sometimes much more so. But then there were also just so many differences that I couldn't relate to at all. My one might be roving between, my brain is curious and driven to look always at new aspects of a problem, whereas someone with autism, sometimes the people that I worked with, their strength, but maybe their weakness was having just a very rigid, down the line focus. That was their thing, and the inability to read subtlety in terms of irony or the kind of things you would just naturally pepper your conversation with. Especially, I have like kind of a very deadpan sense of humor that a lot of people maybe don't get at the best of times. But often I'd say something just like as a joke, and I was kidding. I was kidding around to build rapport, and my colleague was like, "What? I don't understand." And you don't want to dismiss him, but you're like, "No, dude, it was just like, no, it's fine. We're good, thank you." The guy, I don't feel like it would be appropriate to name him, but he was a great ex-coworker who basically taught me Git and was super good at it. So that was a fun experience. Anyway, Herman and Corin, I'd love to chat today about what neurodiversity means in practice. Is it just a label we stick on people, or is there actually a reason? And for those of us who do identify as neurodiverse, what can we actually do about it in terms of, I feel like one of the things we can achieve by banding together under our different conditions is actually better treatment in the workplace, maybe more support for compensation, by which I mean supportive working environments. I feel like the open office is one of those things I personally is immensely challenging for me, and maybe for others. But yeah, Herman and Corin, let's hear about neurodiversity in today's episode.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to my weird prompts. I am Corn, and I am sitting here in our living room in Jerusalem with my brother. It is a beautiful, slightly chilly February afternoon in 2026, and we are looking out over the hills, sipping some tea, and getting ready to tackle a topic that has been sitting in our inbox for a while now.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I am genuinely excited for this one. It is a topic that touches on biology, sociology, and the very way we structure our civilization. It is one of those big picture ideas that changes how you see every person you walk past on the street.
Exactly. So, today's prompt comes from Daniel. He sent us a great audio message reflecting on his own journey with an ADHD diagnosis later in life. Daniel's question is about a term that has really moved from the fringes of academic discourse into the absolute mainstream over the last few years, and that is neurodiversity. Daniel was asking about the actual scope of it. Is it just autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or does it go further? And more importantly, he wants to know about the actual utility of the term. Since neurodivergent is not a clinical diagnosis you get from a doctor, you don't walk out with a slip of paper saying diagnosis neurodivergent. Why does it matter? Is it just a buzzword, or is there a practical, even political reason for it to exist?
It is a brilliant set of questions because there is often a massive disconnect between how the medical community uses these terms and how the community itself uses them. To really answer Daniel, I think we have to start by grounding ourselves in the history. We tend to think of neurodiversity as a very modern 2020s term, but it was actually coined in the late 1990s, 1998 to be precise, by a sociologist named Judy Singer.
1998? That is earlier than I would have guessed. What was the context back then?
Well, Singer was looking at the way we talk about biodiversity in ecosystems. In the 90s, the environmental movement had successfully argued that a diverse ecosystem is a healthy one. If you have a forest with only one type of tree, a single pest can wipe out the whole thing. Diversity creates resilience. Singer realized that we lacked a similar framework for human brains. At the time, if your brain didn't work the standard way, it was viewed strictly through the lens of pathology. You were disordered, broken, or deficient. She wanted to shift the conversation toward the idea that neurological differences are a natural and even necessary part of human variation.
That is a powerful analogy. Biodiversity as a strength. But I can hear the skeptics already, Herman. They might say, sure, A forest needs different trees, but a human brain needs to be able to read, pay attention, and follow social cues to survive in society. How did she bridge that gap?
She did it by leaning into the social model of disability. This is a crucial distinction for Daniel's question about utility. The medical model says, you have a problem and we need to fix you so you can function in the world. The social model says, you have a particular set of traits and you are only disabled because the world was built without those traits in mind. It is the difference between saying a person in a wheelchair is broken and saying the building is broken because it doesn't have a ramp.
Okay, so let's tackle Daniel's first question about the scope. Most people immediately think of autism and ADHD when they hear the word neurodivergent. In 2026, that seems to be the standard shorthand. Is that the whole list? Or is the umbrella bigger?
The umbrella is significantly larger than most people realize, and it is actually growing as our understanding of the brain evolves. Beyond autism and ADHD, you have the dys group, dyslexia, which is a different way of processing language and symbols, dyspraxia, which affects motor coordination and how the brain plans physical movements, and dyscalculia, which is essentially the math version of dyslexia, where the brain struggles to process number-related concepts.
I feel like dyscalculia doesn't get nearly enough attention. People just say, I am bad at math. But for some, it is a fundamental neurological difference in how they perceive quantity.
Absolutely. And it goes further. Tourette syndrome is firmly under the neurodiversity umbrella. Many advocates also include obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, because it involves a persistent neurological pattern of thought. There is also a growing movement to include things like hyperlexia, where children read at an incredibly advanced level but struggle with verbal communication, and even certain types of synesthesia, where senses overlap, like tasting colors or seeing sounds.
What about mental health conditions like depression or anxiety? Daniel asked if it is just a label we stick on people. Does including mental health conditions make the term too broad?
That is a point of healthy debate within the community. Generally, the distinction is made between innate neurodivergence, things you are born with, like autism, and acquired or secondary neurodivergence. Some people argue that persistent treatment-resistant depression or complex PTSD changes the brain's operating system so fundamentally that those individuals should be considered neurodivergent too. However, for the sake of Daniel's question about advocacy, the core group usually focuses on those developmental differences that represent a different wiring from birth.
So, if the list is that broad: dyslexia, ADHD, autism, Tourette's, dyspraxia, does the term lose its edge? If everyone is a little bit different, is everyone neurodivergent?
That is, the everyone is a little bit on the spectrum argument, and it can be quite dismissive. The term neurotypical exists for a reason. It describes the majority of people whose brains process information, sensory input, and social cues in a way that aligns with the dominant structures of our society. If you are neurotypical, the world was essentially designed for you. If you are neurodivergent, you are operating on a system that is fundamentally at odds with those designs. To use a tech analogy, if 80% of the world is running on Windows and you are running on Linux, you aren't broken, but you are definitely going to have compatibility issues when you try to run standard corporate software.
I love the Linux analogy. It captures the idea that the system is powerful and capable, but it requires different commands and a different environment to thrive. Let's get to the practical utility part of Daniel's prompt. He asks, since it is not a clinical label, what importance does it have?
This is the heart of the matter. You are right, Daniel. You won't find neurodivergence in the DSM-5 or the ICD-11. Those are medical manuals designed to diagnose disorders. The utility of neurodivergent is social, political, and personal. First, it provides a shared identity. When you group autism, ADHD, and dyslexia together under one banner, you create a massive political voting bloc. We're talking about 15 to 20% of the global population. That is not a small minority. That is a significant portion of humanity.
And that leads directly to his point about banding together. If you are just the guy with ADHD in an office, you are an outlier asking for a favor. If you are part of a neurodiversity employee resource group, you are part of a protected class of workers demanding equitable access.
Exactly. It shifts the power dynamic. In the last few years, especially leading up to 2026, we have seen a shift in labor laws in several countries that are starting to recognize neurodivergence as a category for reasonable accommodations without requiring a specific, narrow medical diagnosis for every single tweak to the environment. It allows for a more holistic approach to workplace design.
Daniel mentioned his own experience with sensory processing. He talked about how an open-plan office can be an absolute nightmare if you are sensitive to smells, the hum of fluorescent lights, or the sound of a colleague chewing gum 3 desks away. In a traditional medical model, he might be told to take medication to tune it out. In a neurodiversity framework, the office itself is the problem.
Right. And this brings us to a concept that I know you find fascinating, Corn, the double empathy problem. This was proposed by Dr. Damian Milton, who is himself autistic. For decades, the medical consensus was that autistic people lacked empathy or social intuition. Milton flipped the script. He argued that the communication breakdown between an autistic person and a non-autistic person isn't a one-way failure. It is a mutual misunderstanding.
It is like two people speaking different languages. Neither is wrong. They just have different sets of rules for engagement.
Precisely. If two autistic people are communicating, they often understand each other perfectly. If two neurotypical people are communicating, they are fine. The problem only arises when they cross paths. The utility of the neurodiversity label is that it validates both ways of being. It says to the neurotypical manager, you aren't the default correct way of communicating, you are just one way. Your employee isn't failing to be social, they are being social in a different dialect.
That is a huge shift in perspective. But Herman, I want to push back a bit on the practical side, because I know some listeners will be thinking this. Is there a risk that by grouping all these conditions together, we overlook the specific, sometimes very difficult, needs of each? The support needed for someone with profound, nonverbal autism is worlds away from the support needed for a high-flying architect with dyslexia. Does the neurodiversity label risk sugarcoating the struggle?
That is the most significant critique of the movement, often coming from parents of children with high support needs. They worry that by calling it a difference rather than a disorder, we might lose the funding for essential medical and behavioral therapies. But the leading thinkers in the field argue that these two things aren't mutually exclusive. You can acknowledge that a person has significant challenges that require intensive support while still maintaining that they have a right to exist as they are, without being cured of their identity.
So it is about both and. You can have the clinical diagnosis to get the insurance coverage for therapy, and the neurodiversity label to ensure you aren't treated as a second-class citizen.
Exactly. And let's look at the spiky profile concept, which is a great practical tool for Daniel to use in the workplace. Most neurotypical people have a relatively flat profile of abilities. They are pretty good at reading, pretty good at math, pretty good at social stuff. Neurodivergent people often have spiky profiles. They might be in the 99th percentile for pattern recognition or coding, but in the 5th percentile for executive function, like remembering to pay a bill or organizing a calendar.
I see this all the time in tech circles. Someone who can solve a complex architectural problem in their head, but can't keep their desk clean or show up to a meeting on time.
In the old model, we would spend all our energy trying to fix the low points of the spike. We would put that person in remedial organization training and ignore their genius. The neurodiversity model says, let's support the low points, maybe get them an assistant or use AI tools to manage their schedule, so they can spend all their time on the high peaks where they provide the most value. That is a massive win for the individual and the company.
Speaking of 2026, we have to talk about how technology and AI have changed this. Daniel asked about practical reasons for the label. I feel like we are in an era where neuro-inclusive tech is becoming the standard.
It really is. Think about the curb cut effect. This is the idea that things designed for people with disabilities end up helping everyone. Curb cuts were made for wheelchairs, but they are used by people with strollers, delivery workers with carts, and travelers with luggage. In 2026, we see this with AI. Tools designed to help people with ADHD stay focused or help people with dyslexia read, like real-time text-to-speech or AI-generated summaries, are now being used by everyone.
Or the live captioning on video calls. That started as an accessibility feature for the DHH community and neurodivergent people who struggle with auditory processing. But now, everyone uses it when they are in a noisy coffee shop or just want to make sure they didn't miss a word.
Exactly. When we band together under the neurodiversity banner, we push for these universal design features. A neuro-inclusive workplace isn't just better for the guy with ADHD, it is better for the parent who is sleep deprived, the worker who is grieving, and the person who just works better in silence. It raises the floor for everyone.
I want to go back to Daniel's point about better treatment and support. What does that actually look like in a modern company? We have moved past just giving someone a quiet room, right?
We have. In 2026, leading companies like Microsoft, SAP, and even some of the big law firms have moved towards skills-based hiring instead of interview-based hiring. The traditional job interview is basically a test of social performance. You have to make eye contact, engage in small talk, and read the interviewer's subtle cues. For many neurodivergent people, especially those on the autism spectrum, they might be the most qualified person for the technical aspects of the job, but they fail the vibe check.
Which is a terrible way to hire if you want the best talent.
It is. So these companies are swapping the interview for work trials or auditions. You come in for a week, you do the actual work, and they see how you perform. That is a direct result of the neurodiversity movement. It is a practical structural change that removes the barrier for people whose brains don't do small talk, but do complex data analysis perfectly.
There is also the issue of masking. We should probably explain that for Daniel, because it is a huge part of why this label matters for mental health.
Masking is the process of suppressing your natural behaviors and mimicking neurotypical social cues just to survive. It is like running a heavy, resource-intensive background program on your laptop. If you are autistic, you might be manually reminding yourself to make eye contact every 5 seconds, or suppressing the urge to fidget. If you have ADHD, you might be using every ounce of your willpower to sit still in a 3-hour meeting.
And that leads to burnout.
It leads to massive burnout. People who mask for decades often hit a wall in their 30s or 40s where they just can't do it anymore. By embracing the neurodiversity label, you are giving yourself permission to stop masking. You are saying, I am going to wear my noise-canceling headphones in the office, and I am not going to make eye contact during this deep dive session because that is how my brain works best. When you stop wasting energy on the performance of being normal, you have so much more energy for your actual life and work.
It sounds like the label is a form of cognitive liberty. The right to have a brain that functions differently without being penalized for it.
That is a beautiful way to put it, cognitive liberty. And it is also about the joy of finding your tribe. Daniel asked what can be achieved by banding together. One of the most powerful things is the realization that you aren't a failed version of a normal person. You are a perfectly successful version of a different kind of person. When you meet other people with spiky profiles, you stop feeling like a project that needs to be fixed.
I think about the history of the Mad Pride movement or the deaf culture movement. They moved from being patients to being a culture. Is that where neurodiversity is heading?
It is already there. We are seeing the rise of neurodivergent culture art, literature, and even humor that is specifically geared toward the way these brains work. There is a specific kind of ADHD humor or autistic joy that you see in online communities. It is about celebrating the hyper-focus, the deep passions, and the unique ways of seeing patterns that others miss.
Let's talk about the global perspective for a second. We are sitting here in Jerusalem. Does this framework translate across cultures? Daniel's prompt feels very rooted in a Western workplace context.
That is a really astute observation, Korn. The terminology is definitely Western-centric, but the underlying reality is universal. Every culture has people who process information differently. In some traditional cultures, someone who might be labeled autistic in the West might be seen as having a sacred focus or being a keeper of specific tribal knowledge. Someone with ADHD might have been the ultimate hunter or scout because of their hyper-awareness of their environment.
So the disorder part is really just a mismatch with modern industrial society.
Exactly. If you take a person with high-energy ADHD and put them in a 19th century factory or a 21st century cubicle, they are disordered. If you put them in a high-stakes, rapidly changing environment like a first responder or a creative director, they are a superstar. The neurodiversity movement is trying to build a world where you don't have to be a superstar just to be accepted. You should be able to be an average neurodivergent person and still have a seat at the table.
I want to touch on one more thing Daniel asked. Is it just a label we stick on people? There is a fear of labeling, especially for children. Parents worry that a label will limit their child's potential.
I understand that fear, but the data actually suggests the opposite. A label like neurodivergent or dyslexic provides a map. Without the map, the child just thinks they are stupid or bad. When they get the label, they realize, oh, my brain just uses a different path to get to the same destination. It replaces shame with strategy. Instead of, I can't do this, it becomes, I can't do this that way. I need to do it this way.
It is about agency. If you don't have a name for your experience, you're a victim of it. If you have a name, you can be the architect of your own life.
Precisely. And for Daniel, who got his diagnosis later in life, that label often brings a massive sense of grief for the years spent wondering why things were so hard, followed by a massive sense of relief. It is a reauthoring of your entire life story. You aren't the kid who couldn't finish his homework. You were a kid with an executive function difference trying to work in a system designed for a different brain.
So, to summarize for Daniel, the scope is vast. It is a neurominority that includes everything from how we move to how we think to how we perceive numbers. The utility is that it moves the conversation from the clinic to the community. It is a tool for legal protection, workplace reform, and personal self-acceptance.
And by banding together, we aren't just asking for better treatment. We are fundamentally redefining what it means to be a normal human being. We are moving from a world of standardization to a world of specialization. In the age of AI and automation, the standard tasks are being taken over. The value of the human brain in the future, and we are seeing this already in 2026, lies in its unique, divergent qualities. The weird prompts, the weird connections, the weird ways of seeing the world, those are the things that are going to drive us forward.
I think that is a perfect place to wrap up the core of this discussion. It is not just about being nice to people who are different. It is about recognizing that those differences are the engine of human progress.
Well said. It is about moving from tolerance to appreciation. If you are listening to this and you have realized you might be under that umbrella, know that there is a massive community waiting for you. You don't need a doctor's note to start exploring how your brain works and what environments you need to thrive.
And if you are a manager or a teacher, the challenge is to stop looking for flat profiles and start looking for the spikes. That is where the magic happens.
Absolutely. This has been a great dive, Korn. Daniel, thank you for such a thoughtful prompt. It gave us a lot to chew on.
It really did. And for everyone else, if you have a weird prompt about the brain, society, or how we are all trying to navigate this strange world in 2026, please send it our way. We love digging into the nuance of these topics.
You can find us at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We have all our past episodes there, including some deep dives into the neurodesign of physical spaces and how the architecture of our cities affects our mental health.
You can also email us directly at show@myweirdprompts.com. We are on all the major platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and the rest. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a review. It really does help the show grow and helps other people find these conversations.
It makes a huge difference. We read every single one of them.
We really do. Well, the sun is starting to set here in Jerusalem, and the tea is long gone.
Time to head out. Until next time, I am Herman Poppleberry.
And I am Korn. Thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. We will talk to you soon.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.